Two very different incidents in New Orleans and Las Vegas share one very common denominator: vehicles. To discuss how they are impacting current and future safety planning, we're joined by former federal law enforcement agent and safety expert Mark Baughman. Good morning, Mark.
Good morning, Ann.
So, these two events on New Year's Day are not connected, but there are some connections and some similarities between the two people involved. Both of the people were former military. In fact, their service maybe overlapped a little bit at Fort Liberty, formerly Fort Bragg. They both served in Afghanistan on deployments, but one has been determined to be an act of terrorism and the other not. Explain to us why that is.
Well, I mean, the first one being some self radicalization there with this individual that it manifested over a certain period of time. We don't know how long, right? Because you have somebody who's thinking, changing their ideology, their loyalties. You took an oath when you become a military member to support and defend the Constitution and the country, and he turned all the way against that. The second one,
The first one being the New Orleans
the New
car
Orleans
attack. Mhm.
car attack. The second one is more somebody that served honorably in combat. They both served honorably in the sense of being part of the military, but decorated clearly, specialized unit, I believe, a Green Beret. So things that he was involved with. Again, it fomented over a period of time, and then all of a sudden, mentally, it became too much for him. And then takes his life in a statement, in a car. Both of them using cars, which are we can talk about that forever. I mean, those cars are used all the time. They're a 2-ton weapon. No matter if you run people over or you detonate something inside of it, it can be a roaming bomb, or it could just be used to run people over. And we've seen this before many times in many events like this.
I mean, cars do present a different kind of security challenge. And obviously, they present an opportunity for people who may not have traditional weaponry to, create large scale havoc or death. But they also allow some opportunities for investigators to track people in ways that, they haven't previously been able to. Some cars even are able to access your contacts or your recent text messages or your phone logs. So I would guess they also, in some ways, offer an opportunity to investigators, even though they can be just a very difficult thing um, to guard against being used as a weapon.
Right. Law enforcement relies on that new technology of these vehicles, and they like to have that relationship with the manufacturers and the car sales people that are involved in it. The people that are involved in the sales of these vehicles, they want to know the capabilities of them. The newer vehicles, obviously, are much more equipped in tracking, finding things. Originally we started, when I was in law enforcement, when these cars started coming out, when they get stolen, you use that star pointer, Starlink, and you find it. But it's gotten more advanced as time goes on, especially with newer vehicles, which is beneficial to law enforcement. There's always some privacy issues here. There's a fine balance with that as well.
Cars, in this case, both were rental cars. Is there any significance to that fact? I mean, they were both, I guess, also rented through a relatively new app called Turo that perhaps it kind of works almost like an Uber for rental cars.
Yeah, that's it does. It almost works exactly like an Uber for rental cars, but it creates some anonymity, and it doesn't, and it allows these people not to have that personal interaction and gaining access to the car.
And what does that mean for somebody who might be planning an attack? I mean, what is the benefit of not having that additional layer of communication or human interaction?
Well, it just gives you one less person that you don't have to engage or talk to, that you might say or do or something, or have to say what the use of the car is for. You're just picking it up and you're going with it. So, again, it allows that individual to give them more anonymity or protection when their purpose, what they're led to do
Mhm.
with it.
If you're just joining us, we're talking to security expert and former federal law enforcement officer Mark Baughman about what two recent New Year's Day incidents tell us about security vulnerabilities in the U.S. You can join our conversation by giving a call at 904-549-2937. You can also email us at firstcoastconnect@wjct.org, or you can reach out on social media. Mark, I want to ask you about the initial assessment of the New Orleans incident that There were concerns that this was a coordinated attack, and that was the messaging that initially went out from officials, that that was what they were assuming, and that was what they were searching for. And then we discovered no, or they discovered, and said, no, it wasn't a coordinated attack. They think he was a lone wolf actor, and everybody was sort of relieved. But talk about why it's maybe more complicated than that.
It's more complicated because when it first happens, the initial shock of it, it's just shocking to law enforcement. It is the people that were involved. Here we have the loss of 14 lives, loved ones. And by the way, thoughts and prayers go out to people that were adversely impacted by this, but the entire community is suffering from it right away. And then immediately you want to go, hey, we need to get in front of this. We have a major college football event coming up. Let's go ahead and safeguard it. Look at the vulnerabilities right away and look for any coordinated efforts by others that may have been involved with Jabbar here. A- And they immediately, in somewhat quick fashion, found out that he wasn't. But it's good to always approach it like there could be others involved. Again, it's safeguarding a city like New Orleans because it is a festive environment. You have Mardi Gras, you have all types of activities there. It's tough to harden that vulnerable area like that. And I guess going forward, that'll change.
But the fact that this wasn't a coordinated attack, I mean, in some ways, it ties the hands of investigators. When someone is acting alone, there isn't an opportunity to surveil them. There isn't an opportunity to intercept communications or infiltrate an organization. And it's a different kind of challenge for law enforcement.
Absolutely is. I mean, so in the situation with him, unless he gets on some social media platforms and start espousing what he feels, or he stays off of it, he's a lone wolf. He's out here alone. He's thinking it. You got to get inside his head. My brother, who's a retired homicide investigator, said a lot of people get away with murders as long as they don't tell anybody they did it. Well, if he's not sharing this with anybody leading up to it, and acting on his own, more than likely he's going to get away with that act successfully.
Because as you note, I mean, homicide cases are almost always, when they're solved, if it's not kind of an obvious perpetrator or a set of, conditions or evidence, if they haven't talked about it, it's really hard for people to learn about that.
Exactly. I mean, you have to rely on the forensics, which are getting better for a situation like that, but doesn't always work. These social media platforms that are out here that are being used, there's so many of them, and it's so hard to monitor all of them. And people say some things they probably shouldn't be saying on it, but it leads them to draw law enforcement's attention sometimes. But it's law enforcement is required and they're duty bound and obligated to go out and interview some of these people, even though they may espouse political views that sound violent or radical. They may never carry it out, but that one that they don't follow up on could lead to something like this.
Mhm. What about, I mean, should people be concerned? The Super Bowl obviously is coming up in New Orleans. What is the concern that, people should have? What do you think law enforcement, what's security doing right now to prepare for that?
I think they're going to, obviously they're going to harden the stadium, the environment around there. There'll be a lot of attention placed towards any uh, areas where there's going to be amassed a bunch of people. There's always, we've had the Super Bowl here in Jacksonville. I happen to work that, and there's a lot of events leading up to it where a number of people are showing up. You have small concerts, you have player meet and greets, you have all types of things. So, and the purpose of these terrorist acts are mass casualties. Well, this plays right into the hands of that.
And so, I mean, what do they do to prepare? What are the ways that they, other than just additional manpower?
You're going to have additional manpower is number one. Number two, you're going to have a lot of CCTV coverage. You're going to have a lot of cameras out there. You're going to have live monitoring of those cameras. You'll have a number of places that are, aside from having the personnel out there, that they're going to be swept prior to any big events. You'll have eyes on it. There'll be multiple surveillance. You'll see the uniform presence good for the omnipresence and gives relief to the people that are out there knowing that there's uniforms out there, whether they're horseback or walking around or whatever. But it's also good to have people out in an undercover capacity, plain clothes, walking amongst the crowds, looking around. You're going to see people doing that, and they'll expound upon that. There'll be so many of those type of individuals, in a law enforcement capacity that are not going to be in uniform walking amongst the crowds.
I have heard that ahead of Mardi Gras that they were gonna be having people, in costume, essentially, law enforcement participating in the parades and the crews and all of that to, for that very reason.
Yes, and you're going to see heightened. Um, the areas are going to be limited on where people can go. Again, more maybe immovable objects, bollards, whatever is going to be placed in areas where it's cars won't be able to get through as easy as maybe it did last time on this particular incident.
Tell us what we know about that too. I mean, my understanding is that these bollards that were in place in New Orleans and some places, including Bourbon Street, had been removed in order to put in some new ones ahead of the Super Bowl. It's not clear that the person who did this attack necessarily knew about that, but obviously he accessed the street that had vehicles,
Right,
near it in an attempt to block this street.
right. And prior to actually committing the act, he had advanced counter surveillance and saw the areas where the vulnerabilities were.
Okay.
So he picked that route. Um, it was just fortuitous for him at the time to do it because unfortunately it just happened in between all that.
And obviously that is not a mistake that they're gonna make again, but everybody has a car or, almost everybody has a car. I mean, there's so many places in this country that seem like they would be vulnerable, soft targets. How are security experts rethinking, what they need to do to make places safe outside of New Orleans?
Well, it's like any other approach. You have to have it has to be multifaceted. So you have to look at it from all right, how many people are going to be there projectively? What's going to be the routes letting people in? Mass transportation should be handling that. Limit individual cars coming to these events. So if somebody's driving and you've already made a statement that, hey, there's not going to be any public access of vehicles, Ubers can only come so far. You're going to also have individuals that are law enforcement that'll be on the high ground and higher buildings with more surveillance on that area to limit those cars from getting even close.
I want to take a quick call from Charles on the west side. Good morning, Charles. Go ahead.
Good morning, everyone. I can see an enhanced role for AI and the security measures for these upcoming events. Can you?
I mean, I imagine AI is going to be a big part of law enforcement going forward, but how might that be used, Mark?
Yeah, and I'm not sure. I'm not, AI is so relatively new, in law enforcement as well. It's good. It can be good, going forward, but it also can be negative depending on how it's implemented.
Surely, like processing millions and millions of cameras, that is something that I guess AI could help tackle in terms of,
It is, and license plate readers and cameras at different places, LPRs. I mean, those are all going to be heightened. Technology gets advanced every day. AI being on the cutting edge of that, and I do believe there is. I'm not an expert in that. It's hard for me to speak towards it, but I can see that as well.
just in terms of the concern about radicalization, is there any sense that people who are serving in some sort of official capacity, I mean, you've had experience with this yourself working for where federal agencies where people have infiltrated, um, who have been radicalized or in support of a very different goal.
Right, radicalized prior to even getting in the agency. There was one particular DEA agent that processed through the Drug Enforcement Administration, was Colombian descent, made it through the hiring process, through security programs, got hired, and later on turned and was providing information to the traffickers. But from the onset, the cartels had pushed that individual through to make sure they could get in. I can see that on many different levels, not just with DEA, which I happened to be with for a quarter of a century, but you can also see it in the military. You could also see it in HSI, the FBI. It's not beyond the pale that this could happen again or is happening now.
Yeah. Well, it's great analysis. We appreciate it, Mark Bachman. Thanks so much for coming in this morning.
You're welcome.